Good morning, good morning. I am Maria Morgan. Hello.
Good morning, and I'm Spark Bookhart.
Welcome to our session on equity in education. Like I said earlier, we're really excited to have a discussion on this. Spark and I had a brief meeting yesterday, and boy, is there a lot to cover. One of the things that really stuck with me that Spark said yesterday was you cannot build a world-class city if you don't focus on public education. And how true is that? And there's so many aspects to it. I often hear the two words equality and equity used in comparison. And we saw that example that Dr. Hendricks showed us earlier. And I'm sure many of you have seen that famous picture of the equality where everybody gets the same help to try to view the baseball game and they're all standing on the same size crate, but the little guy he needs more crates than the bigger guy needs. So the key there is, how are we looking at education from an equality versus an equitable standpoint? And so I'll start out and then I'm going to ask Spark questions because I think he's got a lot of really specific information about the approaches to equity in education. When you look at equality in education, you're primarily looking at outcomes. We want outcomes to be even. We want all children to be able to have outcomes where they are able to achieve the academic standards that are required. They're ready for college and career readiness, that there's proper school funding for all schools, regardless of whether they're in urban centers or out in the suburbs, that there's proper school funding, that resources are available regardless of where a student goes to school. We want to be sure that there's qualified teachers and experienced teachers across the board in all of those schools, regardless of where those schools are located in our metro area. Equity comes in the work that it takes to achieve those outcomes. And so how do we look at and what barriers are there to getting those outcomes that we're looking for all students, not just students that come from economically prosperous families? And so in terms of equity, I always look at it in terms of the barriers being at OCR, we about 60% of our complaints. We were complaint driven. They are a complaint driven agency, primarily responding to complaints filed by constituents that feel that they've been discriminated against based on disability, age, gender, race. And so in those situations, we would look at what was causing the problem or why the person or the parent thought that their child had been discriminated against and come up with remedies and equitable remedies and steps and processes for schools and school districts to implement to create equity and correct the situation. About 60% of our complaints were based on disability. The other 30% or so were race. Well, it's probably more like 25%, and another 10% were based on gender discrimination. So when you're dealing with race, we looked at barriers, physical barriers, for people with disabilities, language barriers, and that can be an ethnic issue in terms of language barriers, cognitive barriers, cultural barriers. And the cultural barriers, I don't know if there's a Spark, if you've got more facts or specifics about children who are not proficient at reading by third grade. The prediction is that they will struggle and have more barriers to graduation and success after graduation if they are not proficient at grade level or above in reading by third grade. And so focusing on those kinds of barriers, what barriers are there that are causing children to fall behind that early and that quickly? And so Spark, what I want to ask you in terms of equity, when we're looking at the barriers that Kansas City is dealing with specifically in our community. I believe that public education is a universal issue for all of our metropolitan area, whether you live in the suburbs, whether you work for a major corporation. I think it's a business issue when we are repeatedly graduating year after year, large classes of students that are not achieving at the academic level that we need them to. That affects our entire community. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the barriers that you've seen in your work and where we can make a huge difference.
Well, absolutely. And thanks, Maria. I think that the my common thesis is that this city's approach to public education has severely underdeveloped the city. I think that the city is poised to be a world-class city, but will not get anywhere close to being a world-class city. There's no way that Kansas City can become a world-class city until it figures out public education. And in order to do that, we've got to dispense with the common narrative, which is tired and lazy and wrong. You know what I mean? It's just like intellectually it's intellectually lazy that the common narrative is, and I'll get to that in a second. And that narrative does more harm than good. And all of our attempts to fix the problem, quote unquote, problem in public education will fail if we still use that lens in order to fix it. Let me do this real quick because I definitely don't want to run out of time before I kind of know this. Can everybody just type in a big capital Y in the chat if you've heard me talk about have you heard me talk about this discussion before? Everybody's, oh man.
A number of people have heard you, but
Number of people have, number of people, I know I haven't. Okay. Well, I'll just finish up these remarks, and then I like to open it up to have a discussion with the group. Right. Of course, my passion work has been to obliterate this common narrative that I speak of, and that common narrative is, urban education doesn't work. There's a ton of them, like, Black children are Black and brown children, and the country's inner cities have all kinds of other baggage that they're dealing with that makes their education impossible. Teachers have to be I'm talking in this sing-songy way because I'm trying not to mimic whining, but teachers have to be counselors and security guards, and it's like all of these common narratives are like a lazy way of thinking about this issue. And I try to make people, absolutely right, Deshaun, I try to make people uncomfortable. Because that's required in order for repair. And I start with this concept because really urban education is really a proxy for inner city Black and brown students. That's the proxy for the term urban education. And I often like to kind of couch this discussion in a historical context. And that historical context is to understand that the very concept of universal public education means that every child receives an education, regardless of their status, regardless of who their parents are, regardless of where they live. But the concept that every child deserves a public education is a concept advanced by the formerly enslaved in the American South post-Civil War. And because America has never settled her race issue, that really doomed the fate of public education, I'm sorry. Now, from the 1870s all the way to 1954, these things remain largely under the radar, under the cover, swept under the rug about universal public education because public education was completely segregated. You know, public education was completely segregated. And then, so no one had to deal with the race question in America. But once once the desegregation efforts occurred, then America had to deal with her underlying challenge with race. And I put it in three categories: race, place, and money. And when America had to confront the problem of race, place, and money, it really, I mean, and I think the institution that it revealed itself most in is education. And that is the challenge with our current public education in the city. And I will just say this one last piece. Because of this because of this inability to deal with race, place, and money in Kansas City, I started by saying that we will start to make attempts at a fix, and those attempts fail. And the major attempt that failed and cost a lot of time, treasure in Kansas City was Kansas City's desegregation efforts. A $2 billion with a B, epic and ultimate failure. And that $2 billion epic failure was because the concept that Black children cannot learn unless they're sitting in class with white children. And because of that concept, $2 billion was spent in Kansas City, the most it broke the record for desegregation settlements because of that 2 billion. I mean, because of that concept, that $2 billion in that was spent in education, in public education in Kansas City, largely went to waste, and because we focused on the wrong things. So I Maria would like to kind of like stop there and kind of elicit some questions if possible, because they'll be kicking us out in a second, and I wouldn't have heard from from anyone. So what do
Does
you
anyone
think,
have
Maria?
a topic that they'd like us to cover or a question for either one of us? And I'm not sure if we unmute or if, I guess it needs to be put in the chat.
What?
I know.
You guys can't unmute?
So Spark, a question has come up. So are you suggesting a type of segregation integration of children by race?
No, I'm suggesting that education, a 100% education focus should be on student achievement, no matter who's there. And we should have high expectations for everyone that sits in our class, or anyone that sits in our class as educators. Unfortunately, there are schools of thought that Black and brown and low income children, for that matter, have some type of inherent barrier to learning at a high level. And because of those implicit biases, because of that lack of high expectations, what we do is we do foolhardy stuff like spend $2 billion to attract white students to sit in a class with Black students, thinking that that will rise the level of achievement of those black children. This is a common narrative, and this was a thought. Go ahead, Maria.
I was going to say, relating to that, the next question is, what do you recommend that KC should focus on to elevate education and moving it forward?
I think that the focus in Kansas City, the focus needs to be, and I'm talking about the focus not of just the education system. I think that the focus of the entire city needs to be on student achievement, high standards for all students in our public education system. And I think that everyone needs to be engaged in this process, from the superintendent or the president of the school board to the janitor, from the C-suite all the way to the streets. Everybody should have, it should be a citywide dashboard on how our students are doing in achievement. I I watched a local school board meeting last night, and I was horrified by the lack of discussion about student achievement. They talked about everything in the world, and it wasn't a single discussion on student achievement. And in order for us to create a world-class city, we have to be focused on the results. We have to look at the scoreboard.
Another question, is the main barrier lack of funding to every school to make sure every student has the same quality of education?
No, I don't think that that's the main barrier. I do think that that is a barrier. I think that that $2 billion that came into Kansas City, there is a backlash effect, and that backlash effect because primarily that $2 billion came because the whole state was taxed in order to raise that $2 billion. So now when you go down to Jefferson City, public education in Kansas City and St. Louis is a four-letter word. So the legislature tries very hard to figure out how to strip funding away from public education in Kansas City. And because Kansas City is largely disengaged around education, um, they lose tons of money. And we in the business community also inflict a blow on Kansas City with our tax incentive policies, which also hurts Kansas City public education in a significant way. So to answer that question, I don't think that it's the main barrier, money. I do think that we grossly underfund education, but I think that our focus on student achievement is a way bigger barrier than money.
Curious to get thoughts on how COVID, or well, first there was how should achievement be measured? I'll let you answer that, Spark. The other question is curious to get thoughts on how COVID has impacted our youth in terms of education, social, emotional learning, etc. There's a lot to say about the impact that COVID has had on students and education. Of course, it shined a bright light on disparities in terms of economics, healthcare, everything. But in terms of education, the digital divide has been a big issue. And the school districts had to really scramble and organizations had to scramble. I don't know if any of you saw that picture of two little girls sitting outside a Taco Bell just so they could get access to the Wi-Fi in the restaurant. And so access to equipment and Wi-Fi and all of those issues, it's really impacted. And there have been a lot of students that have just become disengaged and therefore are not getting educated. There's also research showing that across the country, statistically, we have fallen behind significantly in mathematics, in the area of mathematics, which is needed for global leadership, right? Math and technology and the STEM areas are very important to the way the entire world is moving forward in years to come. And so falling behind in mathematics and science is a real problem for students across the board. Because of COVID, the numbers are even more dismal than they were before. So Spark, go ahead. And they
Yeah,
asked about what are the ways of, how do you
yeah,
measure the achievement?
I'll try to answer that very, very quickly. Number one, there are simple ways to measure achievement. Um, DESE, which is a Missouri agency that is a Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, has benchmarks and measures by which they measure student achievement. And basically, it's what a child knows when they're in certain areas of their articulation um, through school, third grade, sixth grade, eighth grade, etc. And in third grade, they measure abilities, a child's ability to read on the third grade level, to compute on the third grade level, or do math on the third grade level. And by those metrics alone, I don't think that that's the end all be all metric, but by that metric alone, only 50% of students in the entire state are reading at grade level or above at third grade. 50%. That means half of the students in the entire state of Missouri are reading on grade level or above by the time they reach the third grade. But that for Kansas City, in most educational environments in Kansas City, is significantly less than the 50%. or 48%. It's significantly less. And then when you break that data out for Black, brown, and low income children, that percentage goes down to like 18% in the best metric at any school. Listen to what I say, at any public school in our region. So I think that most parents do not know that their child are participating in a school whereby 2 out of 10 of the children in that classroom are actually reading on grade level. Parents, when I talk about everyone needs to be engaged in the process, parents, the civic community, the school, the cafeteria worker, the teachers, everyone needs to be focused on moving that particular needle. So I would start at the basic. There are all kinds of other ways to measure achievement, but hell, let's get the basics squared away. So that would be my answer for Jennifer on metrics.
So I've got a question. I mentioned that 60% of complaints are related to disability status. I'm curious to know, what would you recommend to learning institutions to combat, prevent, or address such complaints? So a little really brief history, or not history, lesson on disability in education. There are 2 primary statutes that cover how to handle disabilities in education. One is the Individuals with Disability in Education Act, and that's K through 12. That's IDEA, we call it the IDEA statute, and that is sourced with funding from the state to provide resources and the ability for school districts, K through 12 school districts, to hire teachers and purchase the resources they need to provide accommodations and things that they need to students with disability. The challenges come up with the other law and regulation, and that's 504, Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act. And Section 504 is more difficult for schools because there's no funding attached to it, but it's still the law. Schools are still required to accommodate students according to 504, and 504 has a much broader reach than the IDEA does. So any student that is qualified as a student with a disability under the IDEA will also be caught under the umbrella of 504. It's much broader. And so often where we saw the challenges, there's no funding. Many times the disabilities are not visible disabilities when they're dealing with 504. For example, ADD, ADHD, those are the kinds of disabilities in K through 12 education. And then sometimes, for example, concussion, brain injury, when you're talking about at the post-secondary level. Those are the kinds of things that are not easily identified. Teachers can't see it. And sometimes even when students tell their teachers, I'm struggling with this, I have post-concussion syndrome, or I've been diagnosed with ADHD, teachers don't stop and they don't do what's necessary to help that student address their disability and then help them get equity and be able to access their education the same way a non-disabled student would. So in terms of how institutions deal with that, it's different for different levels. We dealt with both colleges and K through 12. K through 12, you have to have processes in place to help allow students to identify as having a disability and encourage that at the beginning of the school year with training to teachers and faculty and administrators, and then communication to parents to make sure that they are volunteering that information when necessary and informing teachers and administrators of the fact that their student has a disability and needs an accommodation or assistance, and then ensure that those schools and administrators in a district and districts address those issues. At the college level, you have to self-identify. And so at the college level, a student has to find the Disability Services office or whatever the name of the office is at that institution, and it should be on their website. It should be front and center on the website as to how, if I've got a disability, this has happened to me and I'm struggling in class, I need to get an accommodation. And you reach out to that particular office and put in a request for the accommodation, and they should go through what's called an interactive process with you to help you figure out what accommodations you need to be successful in school. Okay.
I was looking at the chat, and there was a couple questions that I think that I want to suggest. I'm sorry that you guys don't have the opportunity to connect in a two-way dialogue, two-way verbal dialogue, I'm sure. But someone asked in the chat, like, okay, what do we do now? What's like the corrective? I hear the critique. What's the corrective? Which is my favorite. Question, and that is, you have to get involved in this education process. You know what I mean? Find a way to get involved in public education in Kansas City, because your talent is needed. Now, I convene the Parent Power Lab. It's not exclusively parents, you know what I mean? But I put focus on parents to try to build capacity for parents to impact education. And your expertise is needed in helping to educate parents on these issues. So I put my email address in the chat so anyone can kind of contact me, because I'm 100% focused on the issue. I mean, the corrective. Even when I'm critiquing the problems, I'm critiquing it so that we can get to the solutions. The problem is, I guess the issue is, a lot of people walk around Kansas City like there is no problem, like this is not happening. Like our children are in an environment where they are thriving. They aren't. They are not. And trust me, I'm not just talking about Kansas City's public schools. I'm talking about Kansas City's charter schools. I'm talking about Kansas City's traditional public schools. I'm talking about the public education system. I mean, broadly, the public education system are failing the majority of the students that are in these systems. And I saw a question on what can we do to return the students that are just gone because of COVID, and that's another situation. It's just a systematic citywide issue that we have to focus on. And if we don't focus on it collectively as a community, trust me, the actual educational institution won't get it right. That needs to be an issue that we all attack.
There's one about, are these statistics and issues universal across the state line? It's very different in Kansas. For example, I was doing some research on funding. Somebody mentioned that it turns out that Kansas City Public Schools is ranked number 17 out of 5,600 school districts for the amount of tax abatement that they have to deal with. So there are only 16 school districts that abate tax more than the Kansas City area does, and how that impacts Kansas City Public School. Kansas doesn't have those same tax abatement issues in terms of funding. It also doesn't have, I think Wyandotte County certainly probably has some issues in terms of student-teacher ratios and some equitable issues there, but they're slightly different. One of the big things that I think we haven't touched on is, I think public education isn't just, it's a parent issue, but I think it's a business community issue. Things like work-based learning, there need to be more businesses that get involved and say, look, we're going to, and this is starting to happen, but it needs to happen on a much bigger level, both at the post-secondary level and the secondary educational level, where businesses are getting involved and figuring out ways to reach out to students and introduce them to careers. College is not accessible for everybody right now. And so what are the ways that we can go about as a community to help build a world-class city and start to teach children skills and help get them engaged? And if they get hired at certain companies, there's tuition reimbursement. There's all kinds of ways to work differently to impact public education. And I think it is a parental issue, but eventually when you have cities and states that do not put funding behind their youth, you pay a price. High crime, homelessness, you pay a price. It is a community issue. It is not just a parent issue. And a lot of it is funding, but there needs to be all kinds of resources put behind public education and our students. So.
I just talked to support, and they said that you guys should be able to unmute yourself. I would much prefer you guys to unmute
Oh
yourself
gosh.
and toss in.
I tried and it wouldn't let me. Somebody had to.
Murray just put a comment in. Murray, could you unmute? Or is it still not working?
Working.
Okay, so Murray said, I would like Murray to be able to say it, but I wasn't able to unmute. So he said,
I just heard someone.
Is there someone unmuted?
Maybe not. I'm sorry.
Murray said we need to take a collective impact approach to solving this problem. We cannot improve educational outcomes simply by focusing on schools. The eviction crisis in the region has had a major impact on student enrollment, attendance, performance, healthcare, and hold on, I can't see the rest of this. Healthcare and access to it has an impact on education. Transportation impacts education. I agree, Murray. I wish you could speak on this. I think it is a complete community issue. It is not just, if you can't unmute, please reach out to Laura Dryden.
It looks like they just gave us permission to unmute. No, I'm enjoying the conversation. I just think it's important to note, and I'm glad you brought out the fact that this is a city's issue. This is a statewide issue. Somebody asked a question about students that aren't enrolled this year. A lot of that is beyond just the school's problem to solve. And we've known about the eviction crisis. There was a study that Goodbye Kids done in Hickman Mills School District that talked about homelessness and its impact on student enrollment. And we just continue to ignore that and act like students aren't showing up to school because they don't want to be there or because they don't want to learn. What we don't say is that because of the fact that we have about 15 school districts that touch our city, if you get evicted and move across the street, in some cases you have to transfer to a different school district. That's time kids aren't in school. This time kids aren't enrolled. It's not because they don't want to. When we talk about over-disciplined kids in school, a suspension for 10 days is 2 weeks. We don't talk about that learning loss. We don't talk about transportation in some charter schools that don't have buses and what that means for kids' ability to get to school on time. And so we don't talk about healthcare and the fact that for me and my kids, if my kids need to go to a doctor, I have the ability to get them there and back to school in the same day. But for some of our communities, a doctor's visit is a whole day out of school. So I just think it's important for us to think about education from a collective impact approach and realizing how all of these systems impact education and not just put it on the backs of our principals and our teachers to solve. As Spark said, parents, this is our issue. As you said, this is our city's issue. There's a legitimate business case for equity in education. I just wish we start making it.
Absolutely.
So
one of the other issues that was a significant issue under the Obama administration was rolled back under the Trump administration in terms of policy was the school to prison pipeline. I heard you mention Murray school discipline. So disproportionately, by large, there are huge disparities in discipline in terms of children of color, primarily young Black males that are disciplined far more harshly than any of their counterparts for similar and same behavior. And so what we were doing under the Obama administration is requiring school districts to provide us all of their data on school discipline for 3 years. And we were digging into those numbers and we were having impact by going back and having them rewrite and reconsider their code of conduct. There were school districts, for example, touching on what you said, Murray, where truancy became a problem and you were referred to the criminal system for truancy. That shouldn't be the case. And we had school districts roll that back in their policies. And so because there are children we're getting to school sometimes is problematic and difficult to do. And so criminalizing truancy is a real problem. And so again, it's just, there's not enough time. It's too bad because it would be really interesting to be able to really dive deeply into some of these issues. And I was trying to make sure I caught everybody in the chat. Does anybody, if you all are able to unmute, does anybody else have any comments? We wanted to have a conversation.
Can I echo what Murray said? School attendance is so much more than just like, is the kid there? And especially now with COVID, just that, you know, you have kids working during the school day because their parents don't have jobs, or because their parents are sick and can't go to work right now, and their jobs, you know, they need help make ends meet for their families. So like the current reality is kids can't focus on school. And even if they want to focus on school, there's just so much else going on in their worlds. And as privileged adults, we're sitting in the comfort of our homes, and maybe you have like a dog barking or a kid crying, but at the same time, like we're comfortable and we can Zoom and we're okay. But there's just so many more challenges, I think, facing the youth in Kansas City. And, you know, even it, just being in school, like school was that safe place for students, and it's not there anymore. And so I think emotionally it's very, very draining on students. And I think for a lot of them, there's not really like an end in sight. There really hasn't been a ton of movement of districts saying this is a date we're going back and this is what our plan is to reopen. So I think that can be taxing on a lot of students and on staff.
Mary, that's a very important point, because I think it goes back to, or it dovetails with what Murray was saying earlier, of looking at this as a community issue. It's not just this issue of schools. It's an issue of our community's commitment to education, to public education. And we would never let, we would never let any, like another institution that was like critical to the lives of, 50,000 people in our city just exist without any type of interaction. And I think that that's what's going on with education. We have like checked out, like I don't have children as one, or I don't have children in the district. My kids are in private school, or my kids are in a special charter school. Like that attitude furthers the issue, furthers the problem, because public education is a civic issue. It's a civic issue. And if we continue to ignore it as a community, it's going to do what it has been doing for the past 40 years.
Go ahead. I was trying to cover some more of the questions, Spark. I'm sorry. Were you through?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. How can we get children to not lean into their barriers, but rather realize that they are resilient and can reach their goals? I have one word for that, and that's the adults in their, well, it's a sentence or phrase, the adults in their lives, their parents and their teachers. Resilience is something right now that we're getting ready to train employees on. It's something that we need a lot more instruction on, how to be resilient. And that's what needs to be transferred as an idea and a thought process to our children. They find that there's oftentimes a child will see, oh, this is what's wrong with me, and they embrace that. And what parents and teachers need to do is say, oh, that doesn't have to define you. Here's what we need to do to get past it. And once you get past it, you'll be able to soar and achieve what you need to achieve. And so that really comes from the adults in their lives and the mindset and the communication that is used when they speak to that child. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I just add on to that not only the adults in their lives in the abstract, but that adult in front of that classroom. You know what I mean? The adult in front of that classroom that they spend most of their daily waking time with. We have to, not we, but as a community, we need to support teachers in a way that they can give those type of supports throughout the educational process in the classroom.
Okay. Murray says the OCR data is powerful, but it's so outdated that if you are using it to make changes, you could be addressing a problem that either no longer exists or has gotten much worse. The fact that actionable data is so difficult to access, particularly data that is desegregated by race. Now that Biden has taken over, in terms of educational policy, if they pick that back up, one of the things that used to frustrate recipients is that they will go back and get updated data. And so they will get current data for what the situation is at that time. You're right, if they were to continue using data from back when that initiative was started, it would be outdated and may not be applicable. If that answers what you're saying, if that addresses it. But yeah, they'll go back if that becomes a focus of the agency again, they will get updated data from recipients that had those issues and where complaints have been filed. Let's see. Murray, did that address what you were talking about?
Yeah, I was just saying, like, currently, if you go on OCR data right now, 2019 is the most recent survey year. 2017 is the most recent,
okay.
is the most recent survey year available. We're in 2021. So with the way schools are changing, with the way demographic shifts are happening, if you're a school trying to use 2017 data to make changes, I mean, that's probably not even your issue anymore. So to your point, I hope that changes.
Yeah, no, that is the Civil Rights Data Collection, CRDC it's called. And yes, that tends to lag typically 2 or 3 years behind the current year that we're in. When OCR decides to do what's called a compliance review, which is a proactive review based on, it can be anecdotal information that we gather from newspapers or issues that occur, or the CRDC, we will get current. OCR gets current information before they proceed forward with analyzing anything. So yes, that CRDC data gives us a snapshot of how things have been, but if there's something that's identified there, they then go to the recipient and get current data before they begin any kind of analysis. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to contribute or say or question?
I would like to just comment on Tammy's question from the chat when she said, how can we get children to not lean into their barriers, but rather realize that they are resilient and can reach their goal? And I totally agree with what has been said as far as it's the adults and the teachers working together. What came to mind initially as you guys were having that discussion was it takes a village to raise a child. And I also believe that it takes resources as well. So educating the individuals first and foremost to let them know that there are resources out there to help them as individuals, to help empower the children. That goes a long way. And so we kind of have to scale back and dig to see what's in the soil, what's available to us already, and then how can we access it and then encourage people, teachers and adults, the child's village to tap into the resources so that they can empower the children, and then we can become resilient, right? Then we can have a really good understanding, a foundational understanding of what resilience is, because there's a general definition of resilience, but when it comes down to individuals' lives and situations, it becomes very specific, right? And so I think that in addition to the teachers and the parents and the people in the children's lives, it also boils down to resources as well.
Mm-hmm. And the school districts have a lot of those resources in place, and they are required to advertise those resources, as I mentioned before.